Welcome to Defense Disrupted. My name's Ian, and I'm joined by an extraordinary person, Nick Sinai. He has so many titles. He does so many things. I'm going to give a little introduction to Nick and then get into some disruptive conversations. Nick has done a lot of public service. He's been in the telecom world. He's been an investor. He's been a senior policy and innovation leader for at least a couple of presidential administrations. He teaches at Harvard. He is an investor, one of the world's leading venture capital firms, and is also an incredible father and husband. One little piece of confession as we get started, he's also my old boss. So on this podcast, we should expect him to kick my butt a little bit, just like he did a few years back. Nick, thank you so much for joining Defense Disrupted.
Hey, Ian, really great to see you.
Likewise, man. So where are you calling in from? Are you in the frigid Northeast? Is the Boston area treating you well?
Yeah, I'm in Westwood, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston. And I'm actually a California kid, as you know, and my brother and sister live out in California. And this is, I think, the first time that we've gotten more snow than they have.
That's hilarious. You have quite the beautiful background for those that are listening only. You're surrounded by a bunch of great books behind you. You also seem to have some items of coin honor, and a particular book that I failed to mention in your introduction, you're also an author of Hack Your Bureaucracy. I see that over your shoulder. Let's recognize the moment. What's that book that you wrote, and what inspired you to keep bringing it up here on the screen for folks to learn about?
Yeah, so I had the great privilege of serving almost 6 years in the Obama administration, initially at the FCC, and then 4 years in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where we had a chance to work together. I had the great honor of helping start and run the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program, which was a lot of fun. And Ian was in that inaugural class. And when we were in the White House, we saw a lot of people come in, high-profile folks from high-profile tech firms, maybe starting with a G, ending with an E, and many other places as well. And some of them were wildly successful, but also a lot of people failed. Right. And so we just keep a lot of notes on our whiteboards about why people were succeeding and failing. And we like to talk tactics about how to be successful in navigating government, as I was someone who mid-career had come into government. So I really quickly had to learn the vocabulary and the rhythm and kind of the values of government. And so it was just fun to put a bunch of stories and tactics together. My co-author, Marina Nitsa, she was the 28-year-old CTO of the VA. She was told to go fix the VA and given no money or budget. And so we start with some of the stories of Marina's tenure at the VA. She was a first-round Presidential Innovation Fellow with Ian. And it's just great fun to try and tell some stories and some tactics. And, none of this is rocket science about how to be effective, how to be a change agent, how to authentically get people interested in your idea and attract additional talent and resources. A lot of it is, entrepreneurship inside large organizations, public or private. And so the book came out a couple of years ago, and we still do a fair number of book talks, especially in large public organizations.
There's also required reading for anyone who joins Turbine One. It's a literal welcome package. You get a 3D printer and your book, among some other things. And say, if you don't study from these lessons, you're not going to be as effective. I saw you change a bunch of things, Nick. Your impacts are widely covered. I'll celebrate them briefly here. You're part of the team that saved healthcare.gov. You saved lives with some of your tech innovations from the Presidential Innovation Fellows. You transformed the way national security is employed within the Pentagon in many areas of how tech is deployed in the field. And yet, you just said it's not rocket science. Why, if it's not that hard, why has it been so difficult to embrace? Why did you need to write a book about it? Even with the tours, we still needed Doge, apparently. Like, why is it then that so many things could not change if it wasn't that hard to introduce from the inside?
Yeah, first, just a couple little clarifications. I only worked in one presidential administration directly. I've been a part of campaigns and helped administrations on the outside in various capacities, but I've only formally been a part of the Obama administration. And then, with the healthcare.gov rescue, that was certainly the CTO's office, Todd Park, my boss at the time, and colleagues like Ryan Pinchazram. But I wasn't part of the direct team that was part of the rescue, even though that rescue informed a lot of the administration's thinking on digital services and service delivery and was key in the creation of the U.S. Digital Service. This is before it was renamed as Doge these days. So we were certainly inspired and learned a lot by that recovery, but I wasn't part of that. But to your question, government is hard. It is diffuse in terms of lots of people trying to coordinate to do, big important things and hard to do things. And so I think it's worth stepping back sometimes and saying, not just how do I get my thing done, but what is the art of things getting done? And so that's, there's plenty of people who study this from a academic or organizational behavior perspective. And I don't pretend to be an expert in those academic disciplines. It's just fun to see very simple things that work and some things that failed miserably. And some of them are time honored principles, but like the don't waste a crisis kind of thing is kind of one of those things that everybody talks about. But what does that really mean in the context of a public organization? It means that the more that you've done your homework and you understand how your particular reform or your product or your policy or your initiative would help alleviate the crisis, or that certain permissions will be granted during the crisis because there's a better chance of recovery. All of those things are like important to grok. And so, yeah, don't waste a crisis, but it's also like, are you doing the hard work of building authentic relationships, of understanding the problem space so that if there is a change in leadership, if there is a crisis, there's a cadence to these things. And sometimes it's a hurry up and wait. And sometimes it's uh, we have a particular crisis, and it may not be your particular thing is the right thing to advance during the crisis. And it's having the judgment and knowledge and professional relationships to discern that and understand that.
I think I want to correct the record of correct the record. While there are perhaps great and storied academics that study the space, you're also, I think, to some extent, an academic studying, publishing, teaching the next generation of leaders in that space. But you're also, I think the fair point is you're a practitioner, so you've done it.
I'm a failed academic in that look, I've failed in government, failed in industry, failed in academia. So like, people talk about trisector leaders. My buddy Mick Weiss, the professor, he talks about those kinds of skills. And yeah, in academia, I have had the privilege of being an adjunct lecturer at Harvard Kennedy School. The nice thing about being an adjunct is you're the lowest of the low, but it also means like, what are they going to do? I mean, they fired me several times and they keep coming back. And so this past year, I was an executive fellow at Harvard Business School. That was great fun. My friend Mitch Weiss teaches a public entrepreneurship class that's highly rated, and it's about entrepreneurs that are selling to government and folks that are being entrepreneurial in government, like we were talking about. And I was helping Mitch think about, well, what are the defense tech pieces to this? He's got some great canonical cases. He's got one on Shield, right? Because I don't know if it was Ryan or Brandon, but one of those guys was one of his students 10 years ago. And so it's fun to see someone who had taken that exact class, who is now, has a leading defense tech company. But I wanted to make sure that we brought in some newer entrepreneurs and some, defense tech has changed in a decade. And so it's been kind of fun to work with some of the HBS crowd. And I've also got involved. The Kennedy School does have a national security incubator called QLab. So there's some really early stage companies that are, probably not ready for Insight, which is kind of a larger venture and private equity firm. But it's just been really fun to work with these small teams that are at the idea formation, at that pre-seed level as they think about national security customers.
And one of the other things we're going to continue disagreeing about, Nick, is I think you are quite successful, and I think you're a very successful disruptor. You've taught me how to do it. I've seen you do it. You're celebrating the lessons and with humility, and I admire that as well. But you have a few wins that have clues along your successful journeys. There's so much to pull from. I mean, I don't even know where to start. I mean, let's go back to the record of the bit of your history and why I'm so excited to be, sharing your story with the world. While you say you were not as directly connected to some of the transformations in healthcare and technical leadership in areas like defense, you were also one of the people that recruited the team. You brought the folks in, you were early in and helped design the program that then brought the folks, the marinas to the administration to then be able to affect these changes. Right. And so maybe we'll start with some of the people's aspects of these stories. I'd love to learn a little bit more and have you share who some of your mentors were that brought you into this ambition? Where does this desire for change come from? How did you, how did you first get guided into leaving the private sector and even joining government in the first place?
Yeah, so the story is funny where I was on my first day of my honeymoon in Italy. You take if you, at least from Boston to Italy, you take the red eye, so you're kind of bleary eyed, and I think we were transferring. We were going to go to the Amalfi Coast and then Tuscany. So I was all excited for 2 weeks in Italy. Open up the newspaper and it says Lehman Brothers goes bust. The only problem was that 9 months earlier, I had moved venture firms. I had been at a firm called Polaris Venture Partners, and I moved to Lehman Brothers Venture Partners, the venture arm of Lehman Brothers. And so I turned to Christine, my wife, new wife, and said, you thought you married a venture capitalist. Maybe not so much. But the idea was like, let's just enjoy the honeymoon for 2 weeks. There's 20,000 people at Lehman Brothers. The venture arm is a rounding error of the private equity arm, rounding error of the asset management arm. Like there's no way that I'm going to be useful. Like let's just enjoy this once in a lifetime opportunity. And then when I came back, I had to figure out, well, what was I going to do in my early 30s? And I've been in venture capital after business school, but I just thought that this was a great opportunity to serve. And I had been a White House intern. I'd always been interested, when I was 20, I'd always been interested in public service, but I hadn't quite found the entry point. And, if you're not careful, time passes you by. And this was just like, well, this seems like a great opportunity with the financial world just cratering. And there clearly weren't opportunities at other venture capital firms. And, to be completely candid, I kind of had that moment of like, I'm just some Boston area ex-consultant, white male consultant, this venture capitalist who's like investing in B2B software companies. And I was like, fine. Like I was so passionate about the venture world and actually becoming a partner in a venture firm. And like, I had been so focused on that for a number of years, but, I was getting to a point where I was like, is that all my career is doing? And then, quite thankfully, I I had to go find a new career, at least temporarily. And so very naively, I was like, well, I'm just going to go get a job in the Obama administration, not realizing, that there's 8 years of Democratic administration and waiting, that there's, tens of thousands of people on the campaign. There's all these people who Obama was making government cool again. And so, finding a role in the administration was easier said than done. But I think, when things are hard, that actually, you put a lot of effort into it and you really focus and you close down other options. I think that's important, right? One of the things is it's not just the tactic, but it is the doggedness and the effort. And one of the things I've always admired about you, Ian, is your determination and to think about, well, if plan A isn't working, well, then what's plan B and so forth. And why isn't this working? And just to really get after it. Right. And so, I ended up at the FCC as part of the National Broadband Plan, one of these blue ribbon task force to come up with policy recommendations. It was a really fun way to understand how DC works. And from there, I got hired at the White House. You're asking about, well, who are kind of some of my mentors? The second U.S. CTO under Obama, Todd Park, he's a serial private sector entrepreneur. He created 3 multi-billion-dollar market cap companies from scratch.
Real quick interruption, 2 of them before the age of 40. Just make sure I'm not working hard enough. Yeah.
And so he would talk a lot about how important it was to get the right talent, and that if you get the right team, that you win. And he would always say that was the most important thing, was thinking about the talent. And so in all of the initiatives that we were working on, he would inspire us to think about, well, how do we make sure that we are finding the right talent inside our organization, whether that was the White House or a particular cabinet level department, but also how do we tap the best talent from across the United States? And that was the idea behind the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program. And he was one of the founders and the kind of the key catalysts behind it, because he said, like, look, there's a lot of talented entrepreneurs and technologists, principally in the mid-career, who want to serve. And it's not just their technical abilities. I think sometimes people reduce it to, well, their knowledge of technology or modern tool sets, et cetera. And that can be helpful. But I think it's also the energy that new talent brings to projects. And, you might have a little bit of energy here, Ian. And, I saw it firsthand being involved in the Presidential Innovation Fellows program, and more recently with the US Digital Core program I helped get started. I've just seen how high caliber, motivated, but also high EQ and kind of team and mission oriented folks can really, when added to a project, can sometimes make it greater than the sum of the parts. And so I'm a big fan of what I would call people flow. Is how can you flow people into organizations, whether it's for a 6 month or a year-long fellowship, whether it's a shorter period of time. But also the other way too is, can people go and have other experiences outside of their organization and bring those relationships and knowledge back in?
Let's talk about people flow. I will confess, I guess, as a bit of my own journey, my own story, how we first met here for the record. The way that Nick met me was not glamorous. Todd Park, who we mentioned before, extraordinary entrepreneur, was basically giving a presentation. I basically chased him down a hallway. So inspired by his message that I followed him aggressively into an elevator where Nick was standing next to Todd. And I gave a literal elevator pitch to Todd Park. And by the ground floor, he basically said, "Great, when are you going to come work for the president?" I was like, "What? I'm going to school. Which one? Oh, Harvard. We'll figure it out later. And then Nick will figure out the paperwork." Was the short version. It's not entirely accurate, but I'm making it shorter.
No, that's basically true of.
I didn't actually get a job offer that day. It was a bunch of vetting that had to happen, but that conversation was a lot of energy of me. You know what? Just go for it, chase that opportunity, and lo and behold, I guess folks like Nick and I are still chasing it now, all these years later. I think you were really upset to have to stay later that day to deal with who's this kid. Damn it! All right, what's her name again? Was kind of how we met. But that energy can be fun if you're an entrepreneur, and it could be disruptive to those that have been in government for decades before fast talking people like us show up trying to figure out how to help out, right? So let's talk about that talent flow. Introducing, black swans, whatever it may be, introducing new talent in can be disruptive. And one of the things that you taught me, Nick, is that the current operations of particularly national security and defense and warfare, current operations is perceived as the lowest risk. What they have now has been refined to the point of accomplishing the mission, reducing risk to force, risk to mission. So if something new is being brought in, by definition, it is higher risk. It is disruptive. It is why should I believe that your widget is better than what we've been doing for 30 years? Okay. The talent portion of that is disruptive. So you have pioneered so much of new talent into new parts of government. How have you challenged that risk reaction to the antibodies of new people even if they have the EQ and these technical skills, they're still higher risk? How have you succeeded in those endeavors?
Well, I would say that talent is an important piece of the equation, but the other piece is how can you bring in new technologies, right? And so that's something that I've as an investor at Insight, as someone who's just passionate about all these great entrepreneurs like yourself. So I think that's the other piece, and there's an old line about if you're not fixing procurement or fixing hiring, then you're not really making progress in fixing government. And so I think there's two pieces of if you're really going to make change at scale, you got to not only bring in new talent, but you also got to think about how that talent works with and upskills the existing talent. Which there's a lot of heroes in that existing talent base, and that's why bringing in high EQ folks. But the counterpiece to this is, or the other side to this is, well, why don't we give them the tools, the technologies, the platforms to really enable them to succeed? You're right that traditionally the Department of Defense, Department of War has taken on a lot more acquisition risk because it felt like it could do trade acquisition risk for operational risk. And it's good to see the department realizing that the operations are not sufficient for the kind of the posture that we need, and so that you have to go faster. Like I think it's interesting to see the focus on speed, not speed for its own sake, but it is a recognition that our warfighters need modern capabilities. When you're talking about the ability to see and sense and plan in the world, when you're talking about, what does autonomy and AI mean in a much more attributable and expendable fight, all of those kinds of things are super relevant to kind of the modern warfighter. And that's why I'm excited of like, how do you bring the talent, and then how do you bring the technologies. And there's folks like yourself who have had both sets of experiences of being a disruptor. And I'm not wild about the term disruptor, because I think that a lot of people have these antibodies of like, oh, well, I got to watch out for this guy or gal, right?
Well, let's talk about that as a model, right? So I think it's a little bit into the investing side. Like, so just to caricature, to stereotype, you're a venture capitalist. You could have gone in Elon Musk style, and I don't necessarily mean in Doge. I mean like more like X AI, Twitter style. You could have fired down, see what's left, and then let the best rise back up. But I think a lot of your innovations inside government was, this is going to sound critical, but more incremental. I'm not going to shut down an agency. I'm going to add 20 people on a narrow project that's create wins, build a success portfolio, and then expand more organically from the inside. It wasn't a decapitation. It was an insertion, right? There's different models, right? It's just like in assets of money. You can say, well, there's growth, there's shutdown, there's, there's debt, there's equity, right? There's lots of tools for different tool sets.
I would totally will admit to rethinking my model of change at scale given the last few years. And so I'm, one of the things that Maureen and I preach in the book is understanding constraints and what's really fixed and what's not. And, our observation was that the more that people get used to a system, whether they're employees in that system or just around that system, they tend to see certain things as fixed constraints. And it's clear that the Elon and the energy of Doge really did not see much as constraints, and that's to include laws, to include norms, to include a whole bunch of things. But maybe a different interpretation of that would be that human beings really love to add. And I'm guilty of this as well, right? Can we add talent? Can we add a reform, et cetera? And I think there's really helpful subtraction. Can we do less as an organization so that we can do more where it's the most important? And I think that's just, it's important in any organization to kind of take stock of what you're doing, say what should we do less of so that we can accomplish our core mission better, more efficiently, and more impactful.
I think in defense, it's because subtraction has more consequences, either perceived or actual. There's this kind of startup trope in defense tech and in warfare tech. I love your thing, but there's no requirement for it. What they really mean is, I promised this money to somebody else 6 years ago, and to cut from them and give to you is, I'm going to get a phone call from a senator. Some admiral is going to yell at me. So even if you could actually accomplish the mission more, I'm not going to take that risk, even if it is better. What am I, an idiot? I'm not going to cut from these people. So why don't you go to Congress and try to find some other way to add money to a program rather than taking it away from someone who's an incumbent? That's the kind of real decision point. The person that could move the money ain't going to do it structurally unless they're courageous or there's more mission needs. Like, it has to be some forcing function for it. So your point about addition and subtraction is interesting. Then, where do you see this going? Where do you see the trends and opportunities in, I guess, beneficial subtraction? Right? Like, is this going to be painful, or maybe it's just part of the market wave? Like, are there areas where you're excited about that beneficial subtraction actually working?
Well, I mean, I think there's a ongoing question about, how we're resourced globally. I think there's an ongoing question about, which exquisite platforms to continue to fund. There's an ongoing conversation about how much should be kind of cost plus traditional defense industrial base versus commercial services. And so I'm a big fan of defense tech companies that are taking a commercial orientation. To take one example from my portfolio, Hawkeye 360, for example, right, is commercializing signals intelligence and RF geolocation analytics and so forth. And so that's something that our government does today traditionally, but here's a company that is disrupting with better capabilities and economics and availability and so forth. And so in the same way that SpaceX commercialized launch and Maxar and Planet and Black Sky, commercialized Earth observation, you have a company like Hawkeye on the signals intelligence space. So there's always these trade-offs of how much are we going to do it custom government versus as a commercial product or service. And one of the ways I think about that is the government is more of a price taker and less of the Christmas tree requirements. And this gets back to having multiple customers versus having one big centralized buyer who's telling you all of the requirements and promising you that those are coming from the warfighter, but it's still, this Christmas tree of requirements. And I'm just more a fan of, hey, if we can get closer to the end customer and have lots of those customers, there's going to be better product market fit. There's going to be better product mission fit. There's going to be less noise of trying to interpret what the actual needs are. And so I think the most interesting defense tech companies are those that get close to the warfighter and that have the DNA in and around the company to make sure that they're getting to the end user and that they are not just building once for them, but continuing to build. Because one of the challenges of a PEO or PAE model is that you have this whole kind of centralized infrastructure to try and interpret and make those kind of product management decisions. And those product management decisions are best done by product managers inside of commercial companies. And so while I'm a big fan of government increasing their muscles in this space of like understanding what it means to say no and how to prioritize, that is done really well by companies like yours, where you're spending time with potential end customers and saying, you know what, that feature, not enough of operational units say that that's important to them. And so we're going to put it farther out on the roadmap, or we're not going to build it at all, or it'll cost you a lot more money because you're going to take other things off our product roadmap, right?
The price taker point is sticking with me. One of my mentors, another boss of mine, tried to say that in government, not necessarily just defense, just in federal government, there is no ceiling on price because theoretically you could just raise the TAM. And I think as evidence to the point of $1 trillion anecdote you shared, I think, according to our current president, we're going to have a $1.5 trillion budget next year, allegedly. We'll say it's shared publicly several times. We'll see if it happens. So that the TAM just got bigger by 50% apparently with one tweet. So, that I see a contradiction there. I see there's that side and subtraction can lead to efficiencies, but the market is getting bigger. I'll make it more concrete as an example, a somewhat timely or temporal question. Golden Dome, a lot of money coming in recently. I haven't talked to Hawkeye 360 in a while. I admire the company. I just assume they're on that in some way. If they're not, I hope they are because they were really strong in the technical category. And that's kind of in the mission set of that one project. At a conference this week, there was a lot of talk about Golden Dome being the new R&D platform. What I used to think of in the defense market, you heard a lot of things like Replicator or Strat5, these kind of transformative innovation programs. What I think Golden Dome is primarily an opportunity. What do you want to get done? All right, well, it's now Golden Domed, and you're going to get funding for it if you can transform with certain mission-oriented missions. That's not a price ceiling. That's a brand new thing to go charge forward with transformative new invention. So you see where I'm wrestling with this? There's a contradiction there in terms of what I think you said and what I'm seeing on the field with some of these new programs.
I'm not sure that I see the contradiction. I mean, I take your point that there's these big initiatives that have the, remember JADC2, right? Golden Dome, whatever. And then everybody tries to kind of put their program or their requirement and say this is, or zero trust in the cybersecurity space, right? And so everyone's like trying to say, well, this is how we fit into that because this is seen as a strategic priority. This is where dollars are going to be flowing. And so there are internal competitions inside of bureaucracies to be aligned with a strategic priority and to enable and support one, even if you aren't, verbatim what that priority is. And then as people are trying to sell into the department, I think people are trying to use that as marketing in business development and sales. And so there's a little bit of that crosstalk between all the internal competition to be associated with the strategic priority and then all of the, hey, we can support that thing as well. In terms of like the actual market size for something like that, I think you have to kind of say, okay, let's put the marketing aside and understand, where's government spending in reconciliation? Where's government spending, from which program office? Who's really in charge? What are the things that they want to do? And it's always in the context of existing infrastructure. So, something like Golden Dome, you say, well, what are we doing with missile defense today? What are we doing with sensors today? How does hypersonics change that? and what is the opportunity? How does counter UAS? We obviously can't protect every airport and every base overnight. So like, what are the things that we're going to prioritize? And so you start to put some layers on that. And so yeah, it does create, a gold rush mentality, but I think you have to go after it, but also just be sober and understanding what's the real delta, what are people really talking about, and what's kind of marketing fluff.
Gold rush and sobriety. Let's talk about defense tech investing. It's changed a bit in the past few years. Every measure, well covered by others. I won't seek to opine on it. Being a practitioner yourself in that world, what recommendations do you have for the founders and entrepreneurs that are watching this podcast? We lean heavy on those folks, including, by the way, a number of military folks who transition, want to become entrepreneurs, seeing you can call it a bubble, the frothiness, the excitement, just the sheer money going after defense tech. They're trying to understand it. And you've seen versions of this before. So I'd love to hear your recommendations to our audience. What should entrepreneurs be looking at within the broader excitement of this industry to either lean into the hype or to challenge it with greater sobriety?
No, look, I think there's always going to be enthusiasm in certain sectors. There's obviously some enthusiasm in AI, broadly speaking today, right? It's kind of reshaping society, and defense is part of that as well, but there's a much broader conversation about the future of software and the future of AI. And look, we're 5+ years into, a bull market in defense, where there's this recognition that, newer companies are going to be able to provide the kinds of capabilities that the traditional defense industrial base hasn't been providing. And so I think that's exciting. And I think it's okay that some or many of these companies may not succeed in the long run. But so my advice to entrepreneurs would be to make sure that you are really finding that end user and you're iterating with those folks and building something that they really need, because there's a lot of false signal in this market, right? Where you're working on the R&D side, you're getting SBIRs, you're getting all these kinds of things, but you don't have enough connections to the end user. And I think that's where folks coming from uniform can be really helpful, is they may have lived that particular experience, and they certainly know how to navigate parts of the bureaucracy. They may not, be able to navigate it all. And I think there's just some humility in realizing that there's multiple pieces to this, right? So someone who may have been at the tip of the spear and really understands the user in a very concrete way, they're not necessarily going to understand the mechanics of trying to get money from the hill, right? Or they may not understand how a program office works, now a PAE, and how they think. And so someone once said that, the acquisition Navy and the surface Navy, the never two shall meet. But just because you've served in uniform doesn't mean that you're going to understand all of these pieces. And so my advice to entrepreneurs would be, you're going to have to find, between investors, advisors, and co-founders and full-time employees, enough people that can help you understand where to prioritize your incredibly valuable time, right? That is your most valuable asset. And I actually turn around on you, since I'll take over moderator for a second. How do you think about navigating, this complex bureaucracy that has a lot of false signals, a lot of say-do gap, all that good jazz?
It's evolving, and I'm going to answer your question is our constant Perry on guard fencing history as we work together with a non-answer to your question. I think that there's recent lessons. The defense bubble expansion excitement is reaching a sophomoric stage. What started to get hot 3-4 years ago has lessons now from either spectacular successes and failures. SpaceX has gone public. Anduril may be trying. Shield is at a different stage of its company. I think it's about 8-10 years old at this point. There's other companies that you and I both know very well that have lessons in their successes and lessons in their failures. Some companies ain't making it the way we thought they would a few years back. Why did they fail? And so that's actually more of what I'm obsessed with right now, is as they so many of these companies that were early pioneers of this, latest generation of defense explosion 3-4 years ago, how are they achieving growth and escape velocity? Who is achieving escape velocity, and how? Did they take the early buyout with some M&A from some random prime? Or are they like, you know what? I can be the $10 billion company or bigger. And why? And so that's what I'm studying and I'm obsessing over. And so to flip the question back to you, to more of the growthy side of this excitement in the industry, how are the successful firms achieving that escape velocity? Let's say they figure out Congress. Great tech invention, great mission, great people, great talent. Just try to figure out Congress, and now what? Like, we're in, as you get into maybe, add a couple of zeros to your business model, what do you see are the exciting lessons from those that are succeeding that you'd recommend to the, latest entrepreneurs that are seeking to become successful at the growth stage?
Yeah, one thing would be, and this sounds a little paradoxical from what I just said about focus earlier, but it is the diversity of customers, right? And so for a number of the portfolio companies that I work with and many of the companies that I've talked to, having international customers, allied MODs, for example, and they are at different levels of maturity, and a lot of them are building their sovereign defense capabilities a lot stronger, and so I think that's an important kind of counterbalance to, sometimes the U.S. government deciding it's on a CR or it's going to shut down.
Yeah, we had a shutdown just a few weeks ago. As a, that when that happens, I'm sure some people went to Europe. Like, that was probably a smart move.
No, and it's not the kind of thing that you can turn on or off. So, it also speaks to the market size. If you can provide something that is useful to the American DoD or DoW, and then it's also useful to our allies. Like, I think that's the bigger market, and it's probably actually a better product too if you're able to deliver something that is useful to different contexts. So, I think that's one thing. There's this focus on a program of record, right? And so you and I have had a bunch of conversations. I've been impressed how you've thought about inserting or taking over programs of records that aren't doing particularly well as a way to scale quickly. I think that's really interesting. Not everything has got to be a program of record. I think there's some really interesting kind of contrarian approaches. So I'll give another example from one of the companies I'm working with, OneBrief, where we co-led the Series C. That's an example of, when it started off as a planning software and now really is reinventing how an operational command collaborates and works, both for the staff and for the commander. And, they, in their early years, were very much selling to operational commands. And so that's O&M money. There's no programmatic money initially for that company, and there's no SBIR money or any kind of R&D money. They were going to operational commands who were mostly using the Microsoft stack and quite frustrated. And because the entrepreneur, Grant Demery, he had left the Army as a frustrated staff officer, as a young Army captain who, was just tired of the staff work that didn't make a lot of sense to him. And so setting up a software company and iterating with those planners initially, so starting in the J5. But I think that was a kind of contrarian business model, and it was interesting to me to go after O&M dollars. There's a lot of O&M dollars, there's a lot of training dollars. You're not really supposed to be spending that on software, right? And yet there's this weird parallel to Palantir, for example. It's like Palantir was solving problems downrange, and because they were doing that, that put a lot of pressure on the Army for a big program of record, right? So it's like if you're solving problems in theater, in region, that puts a lot of pressure on a centralized buyer inside the service. And so I think that would be another thing to think about is making actual progress, even if it is not the kind of formal, well, we're working down a program of record and we're palming. And look, I want my portfolio to be thinking about how do they get into the palm and how do they get big dollars and all of those kinds of things. But you also, you want to win today. And so how can you deliver a capability? How can you iterate with a customer today? And the nice thing about the budget size is that there is, there is enough money around various places where that starts to add up, especially if you're solving a problem for lots of people.
It's very motivating, Nick. Thank you for sharing these perspectives and for sharing those recommendations. As we round up here, and a final question for now, because I'm going to keep asking you things for hopefully many years as you teach me how to be a better leader, a better person. What do you think your next book's going to be about?
Well, I think I'll probably write something called, Hack Your Career or Hack Your Job Search.
Okay. Is AI going to write it for you? Is that, how do talking about the disruptions there? I didn't know that. So now I'm like, wait, where? How? Okay, fun.
I've gone through several career transitions and career reinventions. That's always challenging, right? Of like, how do you do that? Whether you're going in or out of public service. I talk to lots of folks coming out of public service about those transitions. And yeah, I'd love to kind of take some of those lessons, some of my personal failures, but also some of the successes I've seen of people like yourself, and just put it into a book of how do you make those transitions, and how do you not get so tied to, well, what the past guy did or gal did, and think big, but also, recognize that what you did yesterday can tie to what you're going to do, but you also have permission to learn new skills and new industries, and you can't change everything at once. And I think that's the thing where people sometimes get a little tripped up is you want to change a couple variables. But anyway, it's a long way of saying it'd be fun to do something on that topic. I obviously have copious spare time with teenage 13-year-old daughter, which I
And your old employees chasing you down to try to figure out how they can navigate the future. Well, wherever you end up going, Nick, we are excited for you and want to keep learning from you. We'll put the links in the podcast to your books and lessons and videos and all the things where people can go deeper. If I'm sure I'll give the plug if you don't want to, but if folks do believe that venture capital and private equity is relevant and extended to their business, Insight Partners, where one of the hats Nick wears, one of the best firms in the world to do that, with an extraordinary success record and an incredibly powerful set of minds on that team to figure out more of how to scale success out to the world. Nick continues to have many superpowers, one of them being surrounded by extraordinary people. He is one of the best darn disruptive recruiters I have ever had the privilege of being near, and that continues in his current roles. So I'm sure folks are going to want to reach out to you in various ways, Nick. Where should folks find you? Where should they seek to engage and learn more from you?
Yeah, so the check's in the mail, I guess, is the first thing, Ian. Thank you for all of those exaggerations and lies, but it's very, very, very kind of you. Look, I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. You can just kind of shoot me a DM there, and happy to chat with folks. And if I'm not the right person to Insight, we'll find the right person. We're an entrepreneurial but large shop, and excited to partner with great entrepreneurs.
Nick, thank you so much for joining and sharing some of your stories. And I'll try to keep up with all of your other life lessons offline. But for now, Nick, thanks so much for joining Defense Disrupt.
Thanks, Ian.